Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, frankly, paradigm-shifting piece of legislation coming straight out of the European Union. We're going to look closely at how the EU is fundamentally transforming its food policy, literally rewriting the rulebook on genetic engineering. And this isn't just some minor regulatory update. It's a profound shift in how we define nature, science, and, well, the very food on our plates.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at the core paradox we're facing, right? For decades, the line between a genetically modified organism and a conventional plant was crystal clear in the eyes of the law. But advances in biotechnology have blurred that line so completely that regulators have been forced to ask a pretty startling question. When does a genetically edited plant actually stop being a GMO? How on earth do we regulate something that we can no longer distinguish from nature itself? To figure that out, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the paradigm shift. Second, defining the NGT-1 category. Third, the enforcement paradox. Fourth, the hard exclusions. And finally, number 5, the impact on our food. All right, let's kick things off with part 1, the paradigm shift. This is the fundamental philosophical pivot in European food policy that's going to take full effect by 2028. So for over 25 years, starting way back with those stringent rules in 2001, the EU regulated crops based almost entirely on the process of how they were made. If a lab tech used genetic engineering to alter a plant, boom, it was legally a GMO. It really didn't matter what the final plant actually looked like. The process dictated the regulation. But this new framework, arriving between 2026 and 2028, radically flips that philosophy to focus on the product. Instead of asking, how was this made, regulators are now just asking, what does the final genetic sequence look like? And this brilliantly illustrates why. It really comes down to how the technology itself has evolved. See, older GMOs generally involved inserting completely foreign DNA, say, pasting a gene from a bacteria into a plant, creating a transgenic organism. But new genomic techniques, or NGTs like CRISPR, are totally different. They let scientists make highly targeted, extremely precise changes to a plant's existing DNA without inserting anything foreign. Because these tools basically just fast-forward changes that could theoretically happen spontaneously in nature, the old process-based laws just stop making sense. Which brings us to part 2, defining the NGT-1 category. To solve this regulatory headache, the EU created a brand new, lighter-touch legal pathway. And the magic number here is 20. To qualify for this lighter regulatory path as an NGT-1 plant, the new organism can differ from its parent by a maximum of just 20 genetic modifications. If the edits stay at or below 20, the EU essentially says, okay, these changes are small enough that they could theoretically occur in nature or through conventional breeding if you just waited long enough. Think of it like editing a document. A traditional GMO is like grabbing a whole paragraph from a completely different book and pasting it right into your text. It's obviously foreign, right? But an NGT-1 modification, that's more like opening your document and fixing a single typo in a word that was already there. You haven't added any new material, you've just slightly tweaked the original text. You are basically just running spell check on a tomato. So the crucial point is how these two categories diverge legally. If a plant meets those strict NGT-1 criteria, meaning it mimics nature with minimal edits, it goes through a simple verification process. After that, it's essentially treated exactly like a conventional plant. But if a plant has more complex or extensive edits, it falls into Category 2. NGT-2 plants remain strictly regulated under the old GMO laws, meaning full scientific risk assessments and, yes, a mandatory consumer label. But for NGT-1, that requirement for a consumer-facing food label is completely gone. Now let's explore part 3, the enforcement paradox. Because you might be wondering, why did the EU really feel forced to create this NGT-1 category in the first place? Well, it comes down to the absolute limits of state oversight. Just listen to this stark admission from the European network of GMO laboratories. These are the very experts tasked with catching illegal crops. They explicitly stated in a major report that it is, quote, highly improbable for enforcement laboratories to be able to detect the presence of unauthorized genome-edited plant products without prior information. Essentially, if the original developer doesn't hand over the exact blueprint of the genetic edit, state labs are just flying blind. The reality here is pretty wild. Even if a state lab sequences a plant's DNA and finds a suspicious single-letter change, they have a massive problem on their hands. They cannot provide what they call court-proof evidence that this tiny change was engineered in a lab rather than just being a spontaneous, entirely natural genetic variation. I mean, nature makes typos all the time. Science simply cannot tell the difference between a natural typo and a lab-made typo just by looking at it.
Let's move to and see how this builds a massive contrast with the old rules. Traditional GMOs left what we can think of as a genetic scar. Because they contained foreign DNA, labs could easily use standard PCR screening to detect those unique, unnatural sequences. If a shipment of corn arrived at a port, authorities could test it and definitively prove, yes, this is a GMO. But NGT-1 crops completely lack those unique genetic scars. The old detection methods fail completely when you apply them to these invisible, nature-mimicking edits. Regulating them as GMOs literally became unenforceable. But okay, this doesn't mean it's the Wild West out there. That brings us to Section 4, the hard exclusions. The European Parliament knew they had to put strict safety guardrails in place to address ecological and consumer concerns. So, no matter how small the genetic edit is, certain traits are hard banned from ever getting that lighter NGT-1 status. If a plant is engineered to tolerate herbicides, or if it's edited to produce known insecticidal substances, it automatically gets booted into the strict NGT-2 category. It's going to face full risk assessments and mandatory labeling, the whole shebang. Also, the legislation draws a very hard line for organic farming. NGT plants, even NGT-1, are absolutely prohibited in organic production, which preserves that sector's traditional boundaries.
And beyond the ecology, the European Parliament added significant economic safeguards too. They introduced some really robust patent transparency measures. For instance, if a company patents an NGT-1 trait, they absolutely must list it in a publicly available database. This is absolutely crucial to protect farmers' intellectual property rights, prevent massive market concentration, and make sure farmers can actually make informed choices about their seeds without accidentally infringing on some hidden patent.
So, what does this all mean for us at the end of the day? Let's move to our final section, impact on our food. Let's connect all this legislative and scientific jargon back to everyday consumers and farmers. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer motivation behind this entire regulatory overhaul. The EU isn't just doing this to, hand a win to biotech companies. They're facing a very real climate crisis. They desperately need drought-tolerant maize and pathogen-resistant potatoes. They need crops that yield more food while relying on way fewer chemical fertilizers and pesticides. By allowing NGT-1 crops to be treated like conventional plants, the EU is hoping to rapidly accelerate the development of a sustainable, resilient food system and actually stay competitive on the global stage. But the final practical impact of this product-over-process philosophy is pretty profound. Farmers are going to have full transparency. Their seed bags will proudly carry an NGT-1 label so they know exactly what they're planting. But by the time that wheat is baked into a loaf of bread or those potatoes are bagged up in the grocery store aisle, you, the consumer, generally will not see any GMO label. It represents an invisible evolution of our food supply, where highly precise, lab-assisted edits just blend absolutely seamlessly with conventional groceries. Which brings us to a really fascinating crossroads. The science tells us these NGT-1 plants are indistinguishable from natural evolution. Regulators tell us it's the only way to quickly adapt our agriculture to a rapidly changing climate. But the labels are disappearing. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. Are you comfortable with the invisible evolution of your food if it's the key to guaranteeing our global climate resilience? It is a very delicate balance between natural food and technological survival, and it's a reality we're all stepping into together. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.